Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Emily Sands. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of the co-chairs of Women's March Ottawa for 2021. Tonight, first and foremost, I want to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. Women's March Ottawa acknowledges that we organize, work, and live on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. While we know that land acknowledgements are growing more common, we want to use this as an intentional and thoughtful way to position ourselves and to provide meaningful and thankful acknowledgement to the Indigenous communities whose lands we occupy. As we organize around feminist issues, we recognize the importance of ensuring this work is both anti-racist and decolonial in nature. We recognize the ways in which our presence on the land upholds colonialism and reproduces dispossession and violence for Indigenous people. For those of us who are settlers, we commit to working and learning more about how we can prioritize the rights of Indigenous peoples and encourage participants to consider as well during both this time and after the session. I would also like to recognize and honor that today is the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit people. We remember the Indigenous women, girls, LGBTQ+, and Two-Spirit people who have been lost due to colonial and patriarchal violence. I would highly encourage everyone to read Reclaiming Power and Place, the final report on the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, including the 231 calls for justice directed at governments, social service providers, and all Canadians. This national inquiry's final report reveals that persistent and deliberate human rights and Indigenous rights were violated, and abuses are the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ+ peoples. The full report, which is 2 volumes, calls for transformative legal and social change. So a little bit about Women's March Ottawa before we kick off into tonight's really exciting session. So founded in 2017, Women's March Ottawa is an Ottawa-based and entirely volunteer-run group committed to challenging all forms of systemic discrimination, bias, and oppression. We believe unwaveringly in building an inclusive feminist movement that centers Indigenous, Black, racialized, disabled to low-income, young, old, newcomers, refugees, and 2S LGBTQ+ women and gender diverse people. Traditionally, our program has consisted of a yearly march for gender equity and justice, but this year, both in hopes of expanding our reach and as well as due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we have pivoted from an in-person event to a full week of free online programming designed to bring feminists together to discuss a range of timely and important topics and issues. So if you're not already, we encourage you to check out and register all of our upcoming events for the rest of the week. And you can follow us on social media. We're at Ottawa March across all platforms. So that's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're also incredibly grateful for any financial donations that help support this week of programming as well as future Women's March Ottawa events. Thank you so much to the Canadian Federation of Nurses Union, Rogers, and Councillor Teresa Kavanagh, as well as all of our generous individual donors for supporting this incredible programming. Information about how you can donate will be included on the chat, and you can also find it in the Women's March Ottawa on the Women's March Ottawa website. All right, so to talk a little bit about today's session. So we're going to be continuing our week of programming with what is absolutely going to be an incredible workshop on sex worker justice and feminism, led by Maggie's Toronto Sex Worker Action Project. They'll be leading us through the session for the next hour and a half or so, and in a moment I'll pass it over to Jenny and Ellie to get us started. So we welcome folks to add their comments and thoughts using the chat feature on Zoom throughout the session, as well as the Q&A box for any questions that may come up. But at the same time, we are going to be implementing a strict policy to ensure that this space is safe and respectful. So please know that any comments or behavior that is hateful or disrespectful in nature will result in you being immediately removed from the webinar. Finally, for those who wish to use it, closed captioning is available for this session through Zoom, which you can enable or disenable from the bottom of your screen. All right, so to officially kick off this event, I would like to introduce you to the incredible organization that will be leading tonight's workshop. Maggie's Toronto Sex Worker Action Project, also known as Maggie's, is one of Canada's oldest by and for sex worker justice organizations. Maggie's has served Toronto's downtown East End since 1986. Maggie's provides a wide range of services and supports, but the organization is unique in that they are run by and for local sex workers and operate on the belief that sex work is real, legitimate, and valuable work. Maggie's run regular drop-in programming, street outreach, safe sex and drug use supplies, as well as political and legal advocacy. Maggie's also runs culturally specific programming and resources for Indigenous sex workers, Black sex workers, as well as non-binary, trans, and two-spirit communities. COVID-19 has radically altered Maggie's work. They are no longer able to access physical spaces and drop-in space and have shifted most of their work to virtual platforms with limited street outreach. As many of Maggie's community members have been excluded from government aid and emergency support, they have stepped in and expanded their work to provide emergency grants, food boxes, and street outreach. Maggie's Black Sex Worker Survival Fund is providing $150 grants to Black sex workers across Toronto and the GTA impacted by COVID-19. They have a fundraising goal of $100,000 and are currently less than $10,000 away from their goal. So we will also put their information in the chat if you are interested in donating to the Black Sex Worker Survival Fund. So today we are joined by Jenny and Ellie from Maggie's to lead us through the workshop. So I'll hand it over to both of them now. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. And Jenny and I were talking, we were just texting. We were like, not Emily reading all of our talking points. But that was a really great, that was a really great sort of like overview of some of the work that we do at Maggie's. Maybe I'm thinking maybe Jenny and I can briefly sort of introduce ourselves and sort of the perspective and approach we take to work at Maggie's, and then I can maybe add some of the history. So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thanks to the Women's March for having us here. I feel like I've just been in like feminist organizing spaces so long that I never thought I would see the day where I'd be like, thanks to Women's March. But thanks. And I think it's really important to have space to talk about like sex work and sex worker justice in the context of feminist organizing, because often it's like, I think we'll kind of get into this through the night, but like often it's like very like feminist sort of like narratives that are used to like patronize and undermine like the rights and dignity of sex workers in our communities. So really excited to get more into that. But my name is Ellie Addiker. I use she, her pronouns, and I've worked and volunteered with Maggie's for the last 5 or so years. Initially, like my interest in Maggie's was around like know your rights campaigns and legal advocacy and support, specifically for exotic dancers and massage parlor workers, which is an aspect of sex work in the city, which is like licensed. And so it's like we literally pay licensing fees and renewal fees for the privilege to work in the city of Toronto, but are often left out of like legal responses and don't really have a lot of like direct supports when it comes to experiences of like police violence and poor working conditions. So I was really interested in that coming into Maggie's. But I think my work has sort of like transitioned more like to campaigns that look at like queer and trans representation in sex worker movements, Black liberation work within sex worker justice spaces. Honestly, sex work spaces struggle with anti-Black racism in very similar ways as most mainstream feminist movements do. So campaigns like the Black Sex Worker Survival Fund were really important for us to kick off the ground through the pandemic. And hopefully we'll talk more about that and why that's important, but maybe I'll just pass it to Jenny before I talk the whole session away.
Hi, everyone. We both have a lot to say on this topic, and we're both really excited to be here. So my name is Jenny, and I'm also with Maggie's. I've been with Maggie's for about 5 or 6 years. And my relationship to Maggie's, what drew me to the organization is that, I mean, it's Canada's oldest by and for sex worker rights organization, run by sex workers for sex workers. So the major community focus, and the reason why I wanted to be involved with Maggie's was really a passion to make more resources available to sex workers, more supportive resources, so that sex workers can know how to do their work safely, also how to do their work. Lots of people are getting into sex work for the first time, or have been working and they're very isolated, and there's a lot of information and advice that they end up missing out on in ways that they could be doing their work in a way that's safer, that's profitable. So one of my passions at Maggie's, I'd say that passion has continued to help build some resources and supports for different areas of the industry and different kinds of sex workers. And as Ellie said, we're really happy to be here and to have this conversation, and we'd like to speak about a number of things, and that includes the feminist discourse around sex work and what our community is often up against in terms of the feminists that exist, and the realities of the kinds of implications that feminist narratives have had on sex work, and then what sex workers are doing to push back and also show up for each other and to challenge our own movements. So maybe that's enough about me for now. I think a good place to start off is maybe to give a little bit more context about the history of Maggie's. And then from there, we can go a little bit more into the feminist discourses and the impact on sex work. So maybe I'll hand it back to you, Ellie.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think it's also in talking about the work that Maggie's does today, which I'm really proud of and think is like fairly comprehensive now in terms of like social, legal support, street outreach, political advocacy and education, things like therapy, food boxes. I think it's really important to sort of situate the work we're doing today and our politics today in some of where we came from and our history. And so Maggie's was founded in 1986. Our original name was Maggie's Toronto Prostitutes Community Service Project. We've since shifted language from like prostitute to sex worker, but you know, there's a lot of like internal conversations, personal, collective conversations within sex working communities about the terms that we use to talk about ourselves and each other, the language that insiders and outsiders and current and former sex workers can use. That's really interesting and exciting. Jenny, why'd you raise your hand just now?
That was a complete accident.
I'm not taking questions from you. So Maggie's was founded in 1986, but actually a lot of sex worker organizing movements in Toronto had been organizing like for decades before. Maggie's just ended up being one of the first sort of like by and for organizations that offered like a wide range of like drop-in and community networking spaces to supplement some of the existing legal advocacy initiatives. So we were really founded on the idea of like offering a full coverage of services for sex workers. And so there was, you know, from the early to like right through the early 70s through 1986, there had been a lot of like campaigns for like legal advocacy support, campaigning against gentrification and things like that. But a real gap I think a lot of sex workers identified was like, great that we have all these campaigns addressing like legal efforts and like police violence and state violence and abuse in our communities, but where can we go to connect with one another? Right? Like where can we go to discuss like connect and have drop-in spaces and kind of like sit over coffee, but also like get access to harm reduction supplies, like safe sex and drug use supplies. Where can we go to talk like tips and tricks of the trade of our work? And so some of those like practices and philosophies are still built into our work today. But Maggie's, the name Maggie's is actually after a sex worker and an activist from the 70s named Margaret Spohr. And she'd founded a collective. The acronym was, and it's funny, there's a feminist connection here too, but the acronym was BEAVER. and it meant better end all vicious erotic oppression, Beaver. And it was like explicitly like a sex work support organization. But as some of the work developed and sex workers started organizing and looking to connect with like feminist organizers who weren't sex workers, those feminists found the language of like Beaver and like the focus on like private parts, like that was like really like offensive. And so they kind of had to water down the language and drop that and focus more on campaigns around like street harassment and particular like legal efforts and initiatives. And so from the very early stages of sex worker justice work in Toronto, there had been like a sanitizing effect that like mainstream feminist spaces had by sort of pressuring sex work groups to like not be talking so openly about like sex and sexuality and sex work as a profession. But Margaret Spohr is sort of one of the founding sort of advocates of sex worker justice work in the city. And so Maggie's takes like namesake after Margaret Spohr. But we were founded in the mid 80s following a moment where another advocate, Peggy Miller, had been fairly like violently assaulted by police and was trying to navigate the court system and find not only like legal resources and kind of tips, tricks, how to, but also like direct support and connection to other sex workers who had had similar experiences. And so Peggy Miller connected with people like Danny Cockerline and Gwendolyn. There are a number of people who are still around in sex worker organizing spaces like Valerie Scott as well, to form this organization that sort of created that space and facilitated that space through like originally like it was like Tuesday coffee hours and people would like have conversations and literally like tips and tricks of the trade. We would do, they would run like street outreach programs through the 80s, but because there was no like funding, we're currently a charity, so we have like government funding and receive a lot of donations. But then a lot of them were doing street outreach and handing out safe sex and drug use supplies that they were funding off of their own sex working dollars, right? And so there really is this sort of like mutual aid sort of like model sort of running there, and that it's like sex workers doing the work and putting in like time and energy and resources to support like the collective good within our community in the downtown east. And that's sort of like the root of where Maggie started. And the other piece that's really important in a Toronto context is that we're situated in the downtown east end of Toronto, which has historically been a place in the city where, like Canada's first housing project, Regent Park, was built in Toronto's downtown east end with the explicit purpose, like from local and federal levels of government, to like warehouse poor and working class people away from like Yonge Street, the downtown core, to sort of like keep like undesirable populations sort of away. But in the last, that was in the 50s, but now, in 2021, over the last 2-3 decades, that area that we're in right now is actually very valuable land, right? It's close to the waterfront, it's developing out, it's being highly gentrified. And so a lot of our work around like sex worker justice, on top of doing street outreach, on top of doing drop-in programming, legal advocacy, has also really been like protesting gentrification in the area. And it's also meant that like a great threat to sex workers, is, a constant threat is the police, but increasingly now we're seeing like the presence of like private condo boards, for example, gated communities and neighborhood improvement associations, trying to sort of clear sex workers and our organization out of our home in very similar ways as we saw all those decades ago. And so our organization does so much in terms of direct supports and services, but like I just trying to get across that like in staking and remaining in the downtown east and refusing to leave the downtown east, it's also like laying claim to the fact that like this is where like sex workers are. This is where street-based sex work happens. This is where so many people in our community like live and work. And it's just so key to have like a by and for organization there that's like unconditional support, no questions asked. We don't ask you to like leave sex work or try and teach you like real job skills to like get you out of sex work. We believe that it's like real work. And this is like a very popular expression in sex worker movement spaces. Sex work is real work. And it is. But beyond just that, we believe that it's like not just real work, like we know, like we're a mindful organization. We know it's work, but it's also like legitimate and valuable work that we're able to develop our own relationships with, no matter how like complicated, messy those kinds of relationships are. We really exist to meet people where they're at and support them where they're at. And so maybe I'll kick it to you, Jenny, if you want to talk a bit about some of like the current programs and services that we have going on, and then we can get into some of the COVID stuff too.
Sure, that sounds great. I think the history, like how you laid out the history and where Maggie's is located, it's such a great way of pointing out how like even the location where we're at is very political. Like it's all political. The work that we do, where we're at, and sex workers are such a resilient community, and that certainly includes the folks involved with Maggie's as well. So just to briefly go over our programs. So things are a little bit different now because of COVID, but historically we've offered weekly drop-ins where folks can come and get access to harm reduction materials, safer sex supplies, have a meal with each other, and then there would usually be different workshops during that time, but it was mostly a space where people can connect and have that kind of social connection with each other that is often missing. And we also historically offered peer outreach support work as well, where we'd have outreach teams on the streets, including the strolls. So providing information to sex workers, especially those who are offline as the internet advances, and we see that's where most of the information is, and also handing out harm reduction materials and providing referrals. We also provide legal workshops. We just recently had a Know Your Rights workshop for the new COVID-19 measures in Ontario, and we're looking forward to doing more. But we also have legal supports where if any sex workers have been ticketed during COVID-19, we work with a firm called the Biking Lawyer, and we connect our folks to their folks for some free legal supports. And we've also offered the only Indigenous programming for sex workers. And so that's included outreach teams and sharing in art circles that are led and facilitated by elders. So that's really amazing. And we're also working on new plans for that during COVID-19. We also offer workshops that are very skills-based. Like, for example, like how to use Bitcoin, how to navigate the US-based laws, like the internet laws, and what does that mean for sex workers? So some really big topics. And we also have a monthly support group that's an exclusive space for sex workers, where sex workers exchange their tips and tricks about how to work safely and profitably. And it's a place to have connection and conversation. We've also recently started offering counseling services as well, where folks can receive one-on-one virtual counseling. And we also have group counseling, including a group dedicated to Black sex workers. And we're also able to offer referrals for folks seeking gender affirming surgeries, TOPS surgeries specifically. So I don't know if I got everything, Ellie. There's a lot going on. We've also been doing mutual aid funds as well during COVID-19. The work is always expanding, right, to meet the needs of the community. And COVID-19 has really thrown some new challenges at us. Well, it's the pandemic, and it's also the government's responses to the pandemic that has made us need to do a lot more work and different types of work that we've never done before. To reach community during this time. So we also have a food box program as well, delivering
like, and another thing, like
adding
stuff in front of you right now. Is that how you're doing this?
But maybe actually, while I'm talking about this, I'll tell like a little story that brings us into, I think, feminism a little bit, or a certain type of feminism, I should say. So last year at the beginning of the pandemic, we partnered with Butterfly, an organization that works with Asian and migrant sex workers, and we created this guide. And the guide was for sex worker clients and third parties. So by third parties, I mean that others who work with sex workers to provide their services. So people like agency owners, strip club owners, drivers, so security, people like that. So we released these really expansive guidelines about how to work safely in person during COVID-19. And so this was at the beginning of the outbreak in Canada. And we did it with the knowledge that people, like, there's a lot of people who wouldn't be able to stop in-person working. And social distancing and quarantine is really a luxury. And for a lot of sex workers in our community, they don't have the resources to be able to just pivot to online work and, you know, suddenly make a sustainable income that way. A lot of folks need to work in person in order to buy groceries for their kids and pay rent. So we put out guidelines outlining if you need to work in person, here's some advice on how to do that safely. And then our guidelines to clients were kind of like, don't be assholes to sex workers during this time. You know, be safe. And so this guide went international. And so a lot of people caught wind of it. And women and men, I think mostly women, were coming over to our Facebook page and commenting on the guide and saying things like, well, just, I won't repeat all the things that they said, but they were saying really degrading things about people who do sex work, and that these are victims and your organization is hoping to exploit them. You guys are pimps. Like, there was those types of comments. And so like people were trolling, and we were like, you know, hiding those comments as you do. But it's really unfortunate when you're making a resource available to the community, that those types of comments and ideas often get attached to it. So like, you know, our concern is people who are viewing the resource guide and seeing these really stigmatizing comments as well. And the reason why I tell this story is because it illustrates a very specific and long-standing aspect of feminism, and recognizing that there's many competing discourses in feminism about sex work, but a very prevalent one, I'm sure you've all heard the term SWERF, the Sex Work-Exclusionary Radical Feminists. So these were the people who were coming onto our Facebook, and they were also the reason why we needed to increase our screening protocols for meetings, because we were afraid that these people would be coming into our events because they seemed so angry about our guides, and they were so committed to the idea that sex workers are victims and who are being exploited. And these types of discourses, they tend to be heavily theoretical and not actually grounded in the many different realities and the many different nuances that are actually involved in being a sex worker and doing sex work. And these narratives from sex work, exclusionary radical feminism, it also imagines sex work in a very particular way. So one of the things, it imagines sex work as always, the client is a man, the sex worker is a girl, when in reality, sex work communities and their clients are incredibly diverse. So sex workers are built up of men, women, non-binary folks, other gender fluid folks, trans people, and then clients, it's the same way. Yet we see these narratives from feminist spaces that are very committed to looking at sex work in very particular ways, because the point of the narrative is to see sex work abolished. And if radical feminists who are committed to this, if they were to be open to learn about the complexities of sex work, they would see it's not such a clear-cut answer, you know, that sex workers are victims and that sex work is inherently exploitive and violent. Ellie, maybe I'll give some space here for you to jump in as well if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, like it's really interesting, and also if you're watching, please feel free to like just dump stuff in the chat too, because we're following that. But it's really interesting with abolitionists, with sex work abolitionists, right? Especially sex work abolitionists that are tackling that from like a moralistic sort of space, because I mean, you know, I'm just trying to think of like how to present like often what it looks like to be approached by these people. And it's like, these are the people that are like, sex workers are like receptacles, like trash, like it's like you are just like selling yourself and engaging in harm and you're a victim, but also we're here to save you and we want to help you, or you need Jesus. And it's like, it really sort of, and I say all this just to sort of say that like we're really going back and forth between the victim and like the threat and like the danger piece, like very, very quickly here, right? And often it's the case that sex worker organizations, especially by and for organizations, are characterized by sex work abolitionists as these sorts of like villains, as if it's like we're like grooming people, when actually a lot of our collectives, especially in sex worker justice organizing, are really about people with lived experience in a particular community coming together to advocate for safer working conditions, better connections to one another, harm reduction supplies, right? So, you know, we approach this issue by thinking about it as like, sex workers are the ones who should be in control of our lives, of our destinies, of our working conditions, of our living conditions, and everybody else should be working in solidarity, but taking direction like from sex workers. We don't, but like one of the things that we talk about a lot in sex worker justice organizing is the idea that like, you know, we operate on a few guiding principles, but ultimately that like sex work, what sex work is and like who sex workers are, what we look like, what we do, what our lives look like varies so much, right? But often I think in public spaces, we're sort of given this narrative that's like incredibly polarized. So we're talking about like the Netflix special high-end UK courtesan with like 2 seasons of a show. It's a show, I just don't know what it's called. Or we're talking about like Olivia Benson and Elliot Stabler leading a street-based hooker out to a cop car and protected. Like it's like these two very like polarized ideas that aren't particularly nuanced and don't really delve into the life experiences of sex workers. And really, it's like there's a massive range and many different kinds of sex work. Like at Maggie's First, when we say sex work, we're talking about a huge range of industries, ranging from like stripping and cam work right up to full service sex work, right? We include phone sex workers in that, right? So it includes a wide range of erotic labor. And the second piece, you know, is we also kind of, in meeting people where we're at, right? The idea is that like, we believe that like people should not have to do sex work if they don't want to do sex work. But if people want to do sex work and be sex workers, that we deserve to be supported and empowered through that. And that doesn't mean like, and in doing that work, we deserve the same like basic rights and protections as others, right? Because the reality is that we live in a world now where if you are outed as a sex worker, if you apply for CERB and out yourself as a sex worker, you could risk losing your house or your home. You could risk losing your kids. You could risk being pushed out of school, right? Because of like one, the criminalization, but two, the widespread stigma associated with the work, right? And I think a really important piece about what Jenny's saying here about like these sort of like it's not, the word's not patronizing, it's like paternalistic sort of narratives from feminist organizing spaces. It's so important to address these things and name these things because these philosophies work their way into laws that govern and criminalize sex work, right? And so if it's for those that maybe aren't familiar with like the legal structures that govern and regulate sex work right now, at Maggie's, we deal with things at a federal, provincial, and local level. So federally, sex work is currently governed under a bill called Bill C-36. The title of that bill is the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, right? So even just in the name alone, like the name alone in this title, you really get a sense of how sex work is characterized. Bill C-36 was written and passed with the expressed purpose of eliminating like sex work as an entire profession and characterizing it as inherently exploitative. And so Bill C-36 regulates everything from our ability to communicate with people, set and exchange rates, benefit off of like money earned from doing sex work, and a whole host of other laws that structure how third parties, such as online platforms, for example, are able to like share and host adult content, right? We're starting to see some of this play out now in some of the hearings around Pornhub. As you might have heard, major credit card companies like Visa and MasterCard refusing to process payments, right, to the platforms. At a provincial level, a lot of the regulation of sex work comes through the lens, in Ontario at least, through anti-trafficking measures. So right now, for example, bills like Bill 251, which is proposed as like anti-trafficking legislation that ultimately invests like $307 million in expanding law enforcement, expanding cooperation between law enforcement and social services, and also expanding law enforcement capacities to do things like receive hotel registries if they suspect that sex work is happening out of a particular space, to seize and remove sex workers if they like from the spaces they're working in, if they believe that, if police believe that there's suspected sex work going on. So things that really violate our ability to exercise like basic agency or consent in what we do, and investing in policing bodies, for example. And then at the local level, often through bylaws and zoning regulations. So it's not uncommon, for example, on strolls in Toronto, for people to get like ticketed or charged with trespassing or nuisance charges, or if you're working out of a strip club or a massage parlor, there are local bylaws that govern how that work can happen. And even through the criminalization of sex work, often what we find is that like police in and of themselves are some of the greatest sources of fear and stress and abuse that our community members face, right? And so it just feels important to really highlight that, because often feminist discourses really prioritize like the role of law enforcement in like saving sex workers and protecting sex workers, when often like what we're hearing on the ground, what we've been hearing on the ground, and what we've been saying for decades is that police and criminalization and the criminal justice system are a very great source of violence for folks in our communities as well.
I'm going to read a question in the chat for the people in the live stream who won't be able to see it. So somebody is asking if we could speak about the limitations of the Nordic model, so criminalization of the buyer. I feel like a lot of feminists love this. Yep. That would be great. So Bill C-36 that Ellie was speaking on, that is an example of the Nordic model. And the Nordic model is an idea of partial criminalization. And I say, you know, partial like this because it doesn't work out like that. But the idea is that it's partial criminalization because only the buyers, the clients of sex workers, and the third parties are criminalized. So in theory, that is how this law works. And the idea is that people are in sex work because they're victims, and it's clients and it's agency owners, pimps, other third parties who are exploiting and victimizing them. So they're the ones who should be punished. Sex workers are the ones who should be rescued. And the Nordic model will actually serve to dry up business for sex workers. If clients are afraid to buy and agencies are afraid to help facilitate, the idea is that a sex worker can't really continue doing that work anymore. So that's the Nordic model in a nutshell. And the Nordic model is very attractive to feminists because it plays into that idea of these poor women who need to be rescued, and these awful men who need to be punished. And with the feminist the historical feminist narratives and movements, they're so dedicated to carceral systems. And the Nordic model is absolutely dedicated to the carceral system, to moving law enforcement into sex work spaces and into seeing people being incarcerated for their work with sex work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a false idea, though, that this is partial criminalization. Like there's no partial criminalization, there's no partial decriminalization, because sex workers, they still can't work legally under these laws. And we see the way that the continual criminalization of sex work furthers the facilitation of law enforcement with sex workers. And even though this bill came about, it was Bill C-36, it was heavily supported by feminists, by religious groups, and in belief that this is going to eventually get rid of the sex industry and help women. It's only made the sex industry less safe, and it's only pushed workers further into isolation, especially BIPOC, racialized, Indigenous, queer, trans workers who already struggle to access public services and receive resources. These kind of models make it worse, and often sex workers, they still get arrested, and they're often pushed into like reform programs and are threatened with those types of things, that they have to do these programs. Clients are threatened in the same way.
John. Yeah, sorry. Sorry. I was just thinking, like, but it's just like any model that looks at like criminalizing the buyer is like a method of like saving the sex worker, right? Like the ultimate goal of any of those projects is to like abolish sex work as an industry, right? And it's like anything that criminalizes any particular area of work makes it more difficult to communicate in clear and transparent ways, that makes it more likely that like a client being worried that they might be criminalized might try and operate like more subtly, or in areas where sex workers aren't really able to exercise the same forms of like security or demand like better, like more fair working conditions, clearly because you can't communicate very, like all of that makes work much more dangerous, right? And I think that, you know, like Maggie's takes a harm reduction approach to a lot of work, which like completely flies in the face of any kind of like abolitionist work. Like we believe that sex work like is legitimate and valuable and like should exist for people. And we also believe that sex workers deserve like safe and fair working conditions in ways that aren't like, we're not being pushed into the shadows and forced to negotiate in very like whispered, hushed kind of quiet ways. And that actually being able to operate in very clear and transparent ways is what helps facilitate like safer working conditions for folks in our communities anyway. Oh, and also the diversion camps are really interesting. And they had these in Manitoba for a while. They were called like, I think it was like they called it like the POP program. It was like prostitution. Oh, there was an acronym where it was like, it's like a diversion program, right? But the idea was like you would be like transported away to like often like rural spaces slightly outside of like major cities where sex work was happening. And they would try and teach you like real job skills. And I put this in quotes, obviously, because the idea is that like sex work is not a real form of work. You need like different, more like mainstream employable skill sets, devaluing the labor that exists within like erotic labor and sex work in the first place, right? And not actually addressing the needs that so many people in our community are asking for, right? Which are like safe working conditions, right? Decriminalization of the work to allow sex workers to be our own advocates for better working conditions for us and in our communities more broadly anyway. So, I mean, the idea of like the Nordic model, the idea of like criminalizing buyers, I mean, honestly, very broadly, like anything that is proposed by people who are not sex workers coming in and saying, we're doing this to protect you, we're doing this to help you, without like actual consultation and collaboration with sex work, often just isn't in our best interest in the first place, and just completely misses the point around what sex work is. Because we do need to be able to have like honest conversations about the fact that like, yes, there are unsafe working conditions in strip clubs, in massage parlors, and in many areas of sex work that many sex workers have been organizing around and against for a number of decades. But the solution to addressing unsafe working conditions isn't like abolishing an entire industry and criminalizing it, right? It's about empowering the workers in that space to make decisions for themselves, right? And making sure that outside of sex work, there exists like a set of social safety nets and supports to ensure that like people don't need to do survival sex work if they don't want to be doing sex work, right? Like that's what we need to, like giving people the option and the security and the support to opt out, but then also providing people the security to organize and empower workers within is incredibly powerful and ultimately makes working conditions much safer.
Yeah, I think that's really important to mention, and we can like hash out all these arguments all day, but like there's industries where the work does involve dangerous work, but the response isn't to like criminalize those industries. Like firefighters aren't getting criminalized. Like
people work in mines. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? Like, come on.
Like the approach is to develop policies and protocols and support to make these spaces safe and to enhance working conditions, and that's why we advocate for decriminalization, and that's the removal of all criminal offenses that target sex workers, clients, third parties, and then it's the adoption of all the labor protections for sex workers. So it's moving sex workers out of that criminalized sector, that criminalized framework that comes with it, into a labor framework. And I think a lot of the discourses about sex work and challenging, like, oh, but is it really work? Does anyone grow up and want to be a sex worker? You're selling your body, you're losing your soul. I think those arguments are actually really great. Those are really great discussions to have about work in general and working under a capitalist society, because many of those things are not unique to sex work at all. You can work an office job and feel like you're selling yourself. Like we're all selling ourselves under capitalism in different ways. So that's something I really find interesting about that radical feminist discourse, because it just makes me think so much about labor and work, but it's focused completely in the wrong direction at the wrong people.
Yeah, and because of the moralistic ideas around like sex and sexuality and intimacy, right? Like the things that like the philosophy characterizing those things as inherently sort of like degrading or like shameful, right? It allows people to sort of like project onto sex workers ideas that they actually think about sexuality for themselves, right? And I think it's like it is really important to talk about the fact that like sex workers are present like not only in like pretty much like every like major social movement for queer and trans liberation, for Black liberation, gender justice, and things like that. But if you also just look at like I don't know, I think it's just because like on sex work Twitter, there are sex workers on this call right now, and it's like, oh yeah, on sex work Twitter, that's where everything goes down. But there's this big conversation about like, okay, so like let's talk about this idea of like this question of like, well, do people really grow up like wanting to be sex workers? And it's like, look at all of the cultural like influences that signal to sex work into erotic labor, right? Like sex work, especially if I think about like in music and pop culture and hip hop culture, especially, right? Like the influence and the aesthetic of like Black sex workers, right? The music, the dancing, like the look, the aesthetic, right? Is something that's been appropriated across so many like mainstream scenes, right? Are we really about to pretend as though like sex workers haven't been like historically like glamorized in so many spaces? Are we really going to pretend that Pamela Anderson's Stripperella wasn't like a featured TV series on Spike TV? Like, get out of here with the idea that like people don't grow up aspiring to be sex workers, right? Because in the same way that it can be like that you can go to your job one day and be like, I'm not really feeling this. You can also go in other ways and be like, you know what? There are a lot of things about this work, interacting with people, interpersonal relationships, sex, discussion, right? That really appeal to me. And because there are so many and a lot of I don't even want to be in feminist, because I don't want to call those people feminists, because if you're not thinking about sex work or including sex workers, you're not a feminist.
Yeah.
But in these sex work abolition, I'm like Jenny, how could you? But so many of these sex work abolitionist spaces, right? The actual labor, the work and labor involved in sex work is completely lost, or at least overshadowed by the moral panic around sex and intimacy that signals to a whole other host of issues that these people kind of need to work out around how they're interacting with those ideas in the first place. Many sex workers across industries can tell you and walk you through in great detail the labor that is involved in being a stripper and having to perform and having to do stage shows and interact with clients, right? And manage and interact boundaries and do that on an ongoing basis, right? There are so many things that people in our community can point to as the individual aspects of labor within work. And this is I talk to Jenny a lot, but I talk to Jenny a lot about how in a lot of our movements we use this language of sex work is work, and you should care about to other organizations and movements you should care about us because we're workers and our work is real work and it's valuable work. And that's true, and sex work is work, but also other progressive movements, people in general, you should care about sex workers because sex workers are people in your communities, inherently deserving of basic human decency and respect, and not because of our relationship to labor or capital or productivity, right? You should care about sex work and recognize it as work, yes, but also recognize sex workers as people as well. Jenny, do you want me to stop yelling at you?
I was gonna say
to the chat too. There's some good questions in here.
Also, I just want to say something quickly. You remind me on Sex Work Twitter, I saw this thread of people talking about how when they were kids, they actually did want to grow up to be sex workers. They're I saw Showgirls, and they're I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wanted to dance naked and seduce people.
It's an awful movie.
I thought that was really great. But I mean, also when you're a kid, did you want to grow up to be an accountant, a bureaucrat? Maybe you did, but shouldn't be the deciding factor if a sector gets criminalized. Anyway.
Yeah, sorry, just really, I swear I'll stop after this, but also just the idea that sex workers either have to present this image of I'm 100% empowered and in love with my work and role all the time, or I am 100% victimized in my work and I hate it kind of thing. And it's I think even in terms of sex worker justice organizing spaces, I think sometimes we fall back on this I will address the criticism of sex work from abolitionists by talking up how much I love this work and how great it is, right? And often these conversations and these kinds of sex work abolitionists can box us out of having real and nuanced conversations about the nature of sex work and the nature of our experiences in sex work. And I hesitate to say it's the same thing as working at McDonald's or KFC, which I've done both of, and it was awful. And and the idea that you go into a shift and you don't always have the best time, you don't always have the worst time, kind of thing. And erotic labor is distinct from that. But I think that one thing that's shared across many different spaces of work is that the experience of it and how we experience it is very nuanced. And we also need to make room for the fact that honestly, often sex work can be so mundane and just boring and not salacious the Netflix special or devastating the Law and Order episode, but just sort of mundane, if it's when you sort of divorce a lot of the stigma that people outside of these industries kind of experience. But it's just, there has to be room for the nuance in that. And now, Jenny, I swear now it's you.
No, that was such a good point.
It's so boring. I'm just kidding. Go.
Sitting around waiting. Um, I'm just gonna look at the comments. Lots of awesome comments. Somebody has asked a question about FOSTA SESTA. Has it had a large effect on Canadian sex workers as well? And would you mind touching on that? So for folks who may not be aware of FOSTA SESTA, so this was a set of bills that was signed in 2018 by Trump, and it was meant to crack down on illegal sex trafficking online. And so the idea of the bills is that they hold website publishers responsible in the case of third parties posting ads for sex workers. And this has had an implication on Canadian-based sex workers because so many platforms are US-based. And we're also seeing like new bills come out from the US that will continue to also impact the platforms that sex workers use, like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, remember Tumblr, you know? So those who know about FOSTA SESTA are probably aware that it's undermined sex workers' ability to advertise their services online and to screen clients safely. So for sex workers, most sex workers have some kind of screening processes for clients, and if that can't be facilitated online for many people, they then have to facilitate it in other ways. So undermining these online platforms and the ability to be on them, the ability to use them and speak to clients through them, it serves to push sex workers more into isolation. And FOSTA SESTA, it also perpetuates this narrative that that conflates sex work and human trafficking as well. So that's very much intertwined in this radical feminist narrative as well. Sex workers are victims; they're all being trafficked, and there really isn't an understanding there about what trafficking is, because the intent behind that is to abolish sex work, and the human trafficking narrative has become the vehicle for that. But sorry, I was saying it wrong. FOSTA SESTA is like a recent like major bill, like where we see that come to life. I'm just getting like, feel free to add anything, Ellie. I'm just looking.
Yeah, I'm just also thinking about like there's definitely a lot of influence from FOSTA SESTA and also like other developments in like American politics around like the policing of sex work and like virtual platforms like websites, and we're seeing that play out in like the Pornhub hearings that are happening in Parliament right now, where like there's a standing committee in Canadian Parliament that's looking to introduce.
Oh, I think maybe Ellie froze. Ellie, can you hear me at all?
I can hear you.
Okay, we're back.
Okay. But just to say that like there definitely is like influence and crossover, and also like direct coordination between like sex work abolitionists in the States and in Canada. And the piece on anti-trafficking efforts and sort of their very singular focus on like sex trafficking and the conflation of like sex work and sex trafficking, and especially in an Ontario context, like if Ontario were serious about addressing issues of human trafficking, they would be looking in industries where human trafficking is happening at much greater rates, right? We'd be talking about like migrant workers right now. And the number of cases of COVID, there are migrant workers in agricultural spaces across Ontario being like very drastically impacted by the pandemic, right? We'd be looking at like restaurant industries, for example, but this very singular focus on like conflating like sex work and sex trafficking and making the discussion about human trafficking about sex work is sort of, it's very much in line with like the abolitionist idea of like eliminating sex work by sort of conflating it with trafficking, when really we're avoiding all these other areas where human trafficking is like much more prevalent. I think that's everything I had to add on that, Jenny.
Mm-hmm. Could you touch on the appropriation of sex work aspects? Oh boy, influencers wearing or pole fitness. Oh, influencers while denouncing the sex work community, such as hashtag not a stripper. It's so, where do we start? It's just, it's so wrong. And Ellie, it's exactly what you're speaking to. The sex work has such a major influence on society and continues to do so. And people want some of the aesthetics and the badness, the appeal of sex workers while stigmatizing them at the same time. And I don't know, I think that, I mean, that's absolutely shameful that people do that they do pole fitness and then, you know, say things like, I'm doing real work over here, you know, I'm doing real art. It's not an art to take your clothes off. First, I feel sad that people don't realize it's an art to take your clothes off. But second and more importantly, it completely, it's an effort to degrade sex workers and people who are doing pole work. They need to step up and be advocating for sex worker rights and recognizing the roots and the way that the pole is a sex worker thing. Yeah.
Like you're like a lot of pole fitness, like hashtag not a stripper people, like they're profiting off of like our work and traditions within strip clubs, and like in a North American context, at least across Canada and the US, like often specifically off of the traditions of like Black strippers, for example, in terms of like the look and the style and the aesthetic. And, you know, there's something that's like, and this is where the intersection of like anti-Black racism sort of meets like sex work in sex industries, even within our own communities. But like to think about the fact that like, you know, in Toronto and across many places in Canada, like if you're a Black stripper trying to get work, often you are turned away like right at the door, or there are like very strict quotas around like having like 1 or 2 people on schedule at a time. Very common to be told, like, we have enough of you already. Can you throw a wig on and change your name? Can you change your accent? Can you look less Black? But then it's like you have full fitness models, but also like white and non-Black sex workers who can adopt like our look, our aesthetic, our music, right? And still receive like the praise and the accolades. And so I think that there's something that's like profoundly like painful about that, like as a Black person in these spaces, but then also thinking about what it is for like pole fitness models to be able to benefit off of the look and the aesthetic of sex workers, while like, you know, sex workers are getting like shadow banned, completely tossed off of platforms, like kicked out of their homes, right? Having child services called on their kids simply for being sex workers or being suspected of being sex workers. Like the incredible amount of violence enacted against sex workers, like through like moralistic, like abolitionist agendas, while people can turn around and be like hashtag not a stripper, but in my pleasers on a pole doing the moves that like I got from your people, from your traditions. It's incredibly insulting. It's incredibly insulting for sure.
And another question, so this is coming from someone who works at a feminist rape crisis center. So we know that feminist anti-violence rhetoric has been used a lot to harm sex workers. What is the role of anti-violence in sex worker movements? How do we talk about violence against sex workers without being co-opted? And like Elliot, first thing that comes to mind is what you were speaking to, where it's really hard to have these conversations about like the difficulties of the job or any sort of violence that takes place, because then, you know, sex workers often feel that you know they're casting a bad light on sex work and kind of going along with those narratives. And yeah, it definitely needs to be recognized. Like conversations about gender-based violence have like been very much weaponized against sex workers and against clients. And in terms of anti-violence, this is why sex workers are advocating for decriminalization and why we need other organizations, including rape crisis centers, to advocate for decriminalization is because sex workers want safe working conditions. They want avenues to be able to receive emergency help and support, but it's actually the laws which criminalize sex work. It's the stigma that is pushing sex workers into situations where they can't talk about any of the harms or the violence that they experience. So I don't know if I'm answering this question completely, but it would be amazing to see organizations, especially organizations who consider themselves to be progressive, to take a firm stance on sex work and decriminalization, and to make that known, and to acknowledge the ways that the laws and the attitudes about sex work create unsafe conditions.
Yeah, I actually remember when this apology came out and some of the conversations happening like in sex worker spaces around this, and I'm not sure of like the local politics and like relationships in Vancouver, but I know that we have very similar issues with a lot of shelter spaces in Toronto, especially being in the downtown east. It's sort of like very like the concentration of like homelessness and shelters in the city is like it's largest in the downtown east end, and you can be kicked out of a shelter for being even suspected of being a sex worker. So it's very difficult to even establish relationships when you're constantly expected to be like incognito. But one thing I also think that we could see more of from like rape crisis centers, from other shelters and things like that, is actually like, of course, like the statements and believing in decrim and kind of using the right words, but also like building sex workers into your programming and offering. So like having like sex worker advisory committees on how to run programming, like rape crisis programming and supports that are specific to sex work, consulting sex workers directly around what some of their very specific questions and needs are in your area around like sexual violence and rapid response, because like we're doing very similar stuff at Maggie's now. And it's like, you know, thinking about like the rise of the influx of people onto OnlyFans and online platforms, like we often think about like in terms of sexual violence, and we're seeing like the rise of like revenge porn, for example. So it'd be really interesting to see what what kinds of specific issues and needs that sex workers and sex work organizations in Vancouver identify around like sexual violence and the immediate need for like frontline support. Like often, like I often kind of say this to like nonprofits and agencies that are like, how can we build ourselves up to be like better allies to sex workers? And honestly, it really is about like building in sex workers and accountability to sex worker justice organizations or advisory committees, just like directly into your program plans as well, because there are like very specific and unique kinds of like needs and supports that I think our communities kind of face. I'm just reading through the chat, but for some of my eyes are only going to the comments that are like not questions, but they're just like, yes, like yes, 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 or like, hello. That's the only way my eyes are going.
I see somebody's question where they're saying, it seems like feminists like myself who are trying to dedicate ourselves to police abolition could learn a lot from sex worker efforts, struggles, and history. Would you be interested and open to speaking about this? So on police abolition. Sex workers historically have been on the front lines of pushing for police abolition and police accountability. In the Stonewall riots, sex workers were key members in that, challenging police brutality. And at Maggie's, we advocate for the defunding of the police and the abolition of police forces. And with that, the abolition of other carceral systems as well. So also the abolition of jails. And we believe that these resources need to be reinvested into community supports. And these are long-standing beliefs of sex workers. And I'm saying sex workers, but it really doesn't do its justice because these are such like there's so many communities that make up sex workers, and it's really Black and queer sex workers who have been movement leaders in this. And so I think, you know, organizations who, I absolutely agree, organizations who have the stance on defunding and abolition do have a lot to learn from sex workers, because sex workers have been doing this work for a long time. The work didn't start just last summer or when new groups got together and decided that they, you know, that the place should be defunded. This is historical work that has been happening. And sex work is such an amazing example of the types of interactions with police that happen, and how police don't facilitate safety in communities, but police are actually the ones actively killing people and creating harm.
Yeah, and like active, at least in our context locally, like they're actively invested in clearing us out of our community in the downtown east, right? In the interest of like developers and property owners and like upper and middle class communities, right? Like it's yeah, the relationship between like policing and sex work and individual police and sex workers has like historically always been like very like fraught and tense and very deadly, but it's also like the intention and like the institution of policing is meant to like eliminate sex workers, to eliminate like poor, working class, like Black, Indigenous, like undesirable populations. And so like we're always going to be in that circumstance with them and in that kind of relationship. And I think about like a lot of work at Maggie's, especially over the last like 2 or 3 years, like often it's the case that like when violence happens in our community, or when people go missing or are murdered in our community at Maggie's who are sex workers, it's often on us as an organization or on other sex workers to do the work of like a few years ago, we organized search parties for a community members of ours, Laura Wells. We organized like court and jail support for a friend of ours, Mocha Dawkins, right? Like both are Black and Indigenous sex workers that were sort of specifically sort of targeted or erased, right? We operate in this sex work in our city, and I think across the nation, kind of operates in this space of like with police of being the direct target of like police violence, or like confronted by like complete erasure when trying to like report or access supports from police or social workers or health or like medical spaces as well. So it really is on like sex work organizations to like to fill that void, because if we don't fill that void, if we don't organize the search parties, we don't call attention to our missing friends, if we don't show up at court and jail support, then like nobody else will. So like when Jenny says that like, you know, it's been like queer and trans, like Black, Indigenous sex workers sort of on the front lines of a lot of abolition work, often that has been like the result of like a direct need to, because the police are killing us. They're killing us. And we like in the absence of like a meaningful response, like not only from like government and like institutions around the police that fund the police, but also in the absence of responses from like progressive movements, right? From labor unions who won't recognize sex work as a legitimate form of work or sex work as workers, or responses from like Black liberation movements that maybe don't recognize sex work as a valid sort of struggle within Black liberation work, or queer and trans movements that don't see the respect, that don't think that sex work is like respectable. Like progressive movements often distance themselves from our work, despite the fact that like sex workers across movements have always been sort of at the forefront of many of these campaigns. And so in the absence of that support, and in the absence of like institutional support, it often falls directly on community and on mutual aid projects to sort of fill the gaps.
Looking a little bit more in the comments, is there a list of, or maybe are there a lot of feminist organizations that support decriminalization? I mean, it often doesn't feel like there is. I don't know if that's the reality of it, but I think like sex worker movements could use a lot more support, like from feminist and progressive organizations who as Ellie was saying, who are willing to actively involve sex workers in leadership positions and build in that programming for them. But yeah, Ellie, do you have anything on the feminist orgs? I'm just not really sure.
Yeah. I was like, yeah. No, I mean, like we're in a really interesting time. Like, I think it's like, I've been doing a lot of community organizing work in Toronto, like over the last like decade. And honestly, like, I really do think I've seen a sort of shift where like over the last like 4 or 5 years, I'm finding that like a lot of like nonprofits, charities, like service organizations, but also grassroots collectives, like people are much more open to like like progressive language. And it's like a status symbol to be like, I'm like intersectional. Our organization operates through a trauma-informed, survivor-centric, anti-oppressive, like, I don't know, like whatever other words there are. Like, it's like people and organizations often decorate themselves with those kinds of terms. And so often, I mean, honestly, often it hasn't been super difficult to get like in more recent history, like solidarity statements from like feminist collectives on university campuses, or like signatories on open letters and stuff like that. But when it comes down to like, you know, beyond you being able to use the right words and beyond your organization being able to be like, I'm a good like ally, like capital A, you know, beyond those things, when it comes down to like, we need money. Like, we need money. We need resources. We need you to come to the rally. We need you to sit here and help us plan community defense. We need to collaborate on mutual aid stuff. We need to take on the Toronto Police Service. We need to call out the mayor. We need to call out the NDP to get more tangible support beyond statements. Like, when it comes time to really like to really just like pull up for us, I find that that's where like that tends to be where the solidarity dies off. But I think a lot of feminist groups and orgs and collectives and nonprofits are like increasingly down to like be like to show solidarity in ways that are convenient and make them visible, but not when it comes in time to like put in the work and give us the time and the energy and resources we need to really like act and like initiate and carry out campaigns for community.
That was a fantastic answer. Much better than my, I don't, it doesn't feel like there's, let's see. Someone is asking, does Maggie's provide resources and supports to sex workers who live in broader Ontario? Are there additional organizations that do similar work to Maggie's in other cities that you would recommend? So our programs are specific to folks in Toronto and the GTA. And then of course, like any of our like digital resources go widespread, but there's a lot of really great sex work organizations in other cities and a lot of emerging ones. So I'm definitely gonna like not be able to say them all, but there's in London, Ontario, there's Safe Space London, Sudbury, there's Swan Sudbury, there's Hamilton Sex Worker Action Project. In Ottawa, Gatineau area, there's Power. Also in Toronto, we have Butterfly Asian and Migrant Sex Worker Support Network. So there are a lot of
in Ottawa. Wait, in Ottawa, there's also OIC, but I don't know if that's like I think that they might be like sort of like a collective of companions, but also like do political work. But just, you know, there's OIC.
I think they had a mutual aid fund as well. So yeah, there's a lot of amazing work going on, and lots of like during the pandemic, new online organizing that's happening as well. Oh yeah, Ellie's dropping the links in the Zoom chat, so that's awesome. Ellie, do you want to speak? Ellie, I have a question for you. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Strap House?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so there's a few things. So during the pandemic, like really like devastated a lot of areas of like sex work happening locally in Toronto. But one of the things that we saw that maybe you folks also saw in Ottawa, because I think that there were some issues around this too, was like in like February, March of 2020, in the very, very early stages of like the pandemic sort of escalating and closures and stuff like that, our mayor and our premier main, well, I guess you are premier too if you're in Ottawa. Sorry about that. Um, so our mayor and premier made a bunch of really like degrading remarks specifically about like strippers and strip clubs in Toronto, right? Specifically this like the language of like kind of characterizing like strippers as like super spreaders of COVID, right? Despite the fact that like, you know, it like in Toronto, like we've had like bars and clubs and restaurants be open and like expose like literally like thousands of people in a single space to like COVID-19. But very early on, there was sort of these like antagonizing and degrading sort of narratives around like strippers as super spreaders, which actually like interestingly enough is like not very different from a lot of the same language that was used around like sex work and sex workers in like throughout the 80s at Maggie's, right? This idea that like sex workers are like spreading like disease and like it was sort of the tone that was used against folks at Maggie's and our outreach programs then. And our response to that, just as our response to this, has always sort of been like, listen, it's like there is really like no one person more invested in public health and health and safety and working conditions across our industries than us, like the people that directly like work within those conditions. Like in the context of strip clubs with like John Tory and Doug Ford, right? There's literally no one in, oh, that's no problem that you sent the OIC thing. I'm so glad that someone did that too. Thank you for that. But in the context of strip clubs in Toronto, like there is not one person who cares more about making sure that clubs are like safe, that they are clean, that we have access to like harm reduction supplies and materials than the strippers who work there and who rely on those spaces to be able to like generate money and earn a living, right? So like at Maggie's, we really sort of frame like sex workers as sort of like public health pros and people that really should be consulted around public health campaigns. Lynn in the chat, we're safer sex professionals. That I think we actually had buttons in the 80s that said things like that. I think that's exactly it. But we did. That's great. That's awesome. But at one of the things we noticed in the pandemic, strip clubs and massage parlors closed down very early. So we did a few of us at Maggie started a project specifically with queer and trans Black strippers called the Strap House. And it's like it's a strip club specifically for queer and trans like Black entertainers that like aren't only impacted by COVID closures in the sense that like the workplace is shut down, but are also impacted by anti-Blackness that's like rampant in strip clubs and across industries. So we run like virtual monthly shows and now have dancers from like across Canada, even in the US and UK, which is really exciting. But because it's a space where like Black strippers have been able to like sort of run the show, it's like we've been able to eliminate things like shift fees, right? Which is, for those of you that don't know, when you go and work at a strip club, often you need to pay like a club fee for the privilege of being able to use the space. And that club fee, there's not really, at least in Toronto, there's no cap on what that club fee is. So really the manager or owner can set it at anything. So you could be paying $20 a night to work. You could be paying $200 a night to go into work, depending on what time you come in. And honestly, depending on your relationship with the club owner, which isn't great in terms of working conditions. So the Strap House is sort of like a direct sort of like response to that, and a space owned like by and for Black dancers, which has been really great and ensured that people are actually able to get paid through the pandemic. Also, just a side note to Lynn in this chat, that if you have any photos of those buttons, I'd really love to see them. Not that this is becoming an Ellie Lynn situation, but you know, I'd love for that too. Are you seeing any other ones, Jenny? I'm seeing some in the Q&A around like, do you have any figures on the number of sex workers? And the answer to that is no, at least locally we do not. But that's also a product of the fact that like sex work in our community is so heavily criminalized that like people risk a lot in speaking openly and speaking out. Like Jenny and I risk a lot speaking openly in the context of a panel like this, right? And there are very widespread implications in terms of like housing and child custody, being able to be in school. getting fired from your civvy job for being suspected of being a sex worker. So we don't have numbers on that. We do have numbers in terms of like how many people that we serve, which has really changed a lot from the pandemic. So I'd have difficulty estimating it now, but it's like it's easily in like the thousands, I would say. I'm just trying to see, do we have access to rapid COVID testing for sex workers? I wish we had access to rapid COVID testing for sex workers. Jenny's working on setting up a vaccine clinic though, but it's been very difficult and a struggle to make the case that like we are a population of people that require this vaccine.
Should be prioritized. Let's see, just be mindful of the time. Were there any other questions before the session wraps up? Or maybe like one question before the session wraps up?
What if you just do the last one? How can feminist movements, or just like what can feminists do to better support, like a final kind of wrap up thing?
I feel like I'm not seeing questions anymore. Like all those questions that you were answering, like I didn't see them for some reason. Do you mind reading out the questions?
I was just looking in the Q&A, but they're gone now. They get ticked once they're answered.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Our wrap up is just me and you figuring out how to work Zoom
at the end of our panel. So I don't know, maybe we can just do like one key takeaway.
Sure. I do see one more question though. You mentioned Maggie's doing Bitcoin workshops. Is the idea there to move away from our centralized finance system that the government can control?
Yeah, I won't pretend to know a bunch about Bitcoin still, but Bitcoin, the use of Bitcoin is an example of the way that sex workers need to pivot their work in different ways. So like, for example, we mentioned about Pornhub and these groups like Exodus Cry and like abolitionist groups trying to shut down Pornhub, and as a response, payment processors have stopped working with Pornhub. So often sex workers need to facilitate to other platforms and other methods in order to make money. So Bitcoin is an example of that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can get like when it's like your like PayPal's can get shut down, you can lose your Cash App, your Venmo and things like that. Even for being suspected of being a sex worker, you can lose your bank account and have your accounts frozen. So definitely like the intention in some of that is to try and move out of like some of the mainstream like financial systems and institutions that we're already getting frozen out of, for sure.
That was phenomenal. Thank you so much, Jenny and Ellie. And if to be honest, I think that this is a conversation that could go on for hours and hours, and just the wisdom and the insight and just all of the incredible knowledge that the two of you have shared with us tonight is absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here with Women's March Ottawa and with Maggie's. Please, if you have the financial capacity to do so, I would highly encourage everyone to consider making a donation to Maggie's, and just thank you from everything in me. Thank you so much for what was such an engaging conversation. And I believe on social media, you folks can interact with Maggie's. You're at Maggie's TO, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. So yeah, make sure to check out Maggie's. That I see that my co-chair Chloe is posting a lot of great information. And for folks who are interested in participating in more Women's March Ottawa events, we have more awesome programming throughout the rest of the week, including a panel on the community activism of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people coming up tomorrow evening. It's going to be an incredible evening. So once again, big thank you to everyone who came out this evening. And for folks who would like to revisit this conversation, the recording will be posted on the Women's March Ottawa YouTube page either tonight or tomorrow. So make sure to check all of that out. And Ellie, I see that Lynn is asking about contact information. So that's great.
Yeah, so we're just at info@maggiesTO.org. I'll type it out too. Oh, Jenny already did. Never mind.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye. Have a great night.